Okay, so today we will discuss about organisms and population. So actually, we have to finish this couple of chapters, and we have to discuss at least a little bit before we discuss question answer. So I will be talking about some topic. Okay, fine. Yeah. You can see the screen, right? Okay. So let's start with where we stopped. So in the last class, we were talking about organisms and populations, and some of the topics we discussed, like how the factors on earth like really affects the population and the organisms and how it leads to evolution and speciation. So now as we studied that, we understood some of the factors that actually determine the formation of a biome, correct, right? So today we will start discussing about, just give me a second, we'll directly jump into the slide. Yeah, yeah. So this is where we have to start discussing from, that is what are the factors that affect the organisms or the populations, right? So when we talk about the factors, we have two different factors. One is a biotic factor, other one is an abiotic factor that leads to the physiochemical changes in the organisms, okay, in the environment they interact with. For the first one is the physiochemical or abiotic components, such as you have water, light, temperature, soil, etc. So they all influence on an organism, on the diversity that is present in that particular region. And then when it comes to biotic components, what kind of an interaction an organism can have with its community. So based on that, we have biotic components that influence them, such as the pathogens, the parasites, predators, competitors, etc. So that leads to the formation of various habitats. Now, in all of these habitats, when we observe, whether you take desert or grassland or tropical or any of these habitats, if you take, in all these habitats, what you see is you have this similar kind of an interaction, such as biotic or abiotic, that has led to different kinds of adaptations and evolutions with respect to that. Okay. So now we have to learn a very distinct term that is called as a niche. So what is a niche? For example, if you have any small interaction or in an ecosystem, such as if I take the importance of tiger and its population. Now, tiger belonging to one tropical ecosystem. Now, what is the importance of it in the entire chain of interactions? So that organism's significance and organism's position in an ecosystem, that is called as a niche. Okay. So now this niche, give me a second. Yeah, this niche you can see here, it depends on how its physiological and behavioral adaptations are meant for its surroundings and how it is influencing. Okay. So that is called as a niche. Next one. Yeah. So some of the abiotic factors that influence these organisms are temperature, water, light, and soil. So you might be able to gauge this, how a temperature can influence all these factors, such as I mean, like how the temperature, soil, or light conditions can influence organisms. You can just imagine, right? How what is the significance of light? So when we talk about one of the most important factors that influences life on planet is the light. Okay. Why light is very important? As I've told you earlier, light plays a very important role because it is a very major source of energy for the food production, okay, in the form of photosynthesis. And the second one is it is also a source of heat. So light and I mean, like, energy and heat are very, very important components when it comes to the biology or the life on our planet. Now, how does the temperature changes with respect to the light? We already know with our little bit of knowledge that we have in physics. We know that our Earth from the center, away from the equator, okay, is always less light that is received on the planet because of its spherical exposure. So that what happens is, as the light decreases, now the temperature across the equator, I mean, like away from the equator, what happens is it keeps on decreasing. So when that decreases from the equator, the temperature from 37 degrees Celsius all the way it goes to sub-zero, like -20, -30, or -40 degrees Celsius. It goes, and in some regions near the equator, what happens is there is a very high exposure of uh, of this landmass, and with less precipitation, it has led to the formation of deserts. Now, there are two different variations that we saw. One is the formation of these extremely cold regions and extremely hot regions. And in the same way, very close to the equator or near the equatorial regions, what happens is there is proper precipitation, and there is enough amount of light that is received. So that is where you have very rich biodiverse conditions in such as tropical forest. Okay, and then sometimes the temperatures, you can also see life across the temperatures where it is very high or extremely high, such as deep sea hydrothermal vents where the temperature is around 90 degrees Celsius. Okay, so now this is a representation of how the temperature changes across as we move away from the equator. All right. So based on the available amount of light that is received and amount of heat that we have different organisms adapting accordingly with respect to that. For example, you can expect only mango trees in the tropical regions, but not in very cold regions such as Germany or Canada. Or snow leopards you can't find in any of the tropical forests such as Kerala. You can only find in Himalayas. And then you have your tuna fishes, which are very popular. Okay, they can be rarely found beyond the tropical latitudes. Okay, so why temperature plays an important role as well as the light plays an important role is, so with the change in the temperature, an organism is exposed mostly, I mean, like very highly to this factor, right, externally. So when this external factor such as temperature is influencing, your body has a job to perform, such as you have to perform physiological activities. What kind of physiological activities? For example, digestion, or you have to transport some protein, or you have to build some muscle. So for any of these functions, what should happen? You need enzymes to perform that biochemical reactions. So now what happens? You know that the kinetics of an enzyme change according to the temperature. So higher the temperature, the enzyme kinetics decreases, and in extremely low temperatures, what happens? Enzymes actually shut down, right? The freeze. So that is how the temperature influences the adaptation of organisms by affecting the enzyme kinetics. Okay. So now, based on this exposure to the temperature, organisms have evolved into two important groups. One is the narrow group, other one is a broad group. So, for example, we have mammals, we have birds, and we have higher vertebrates and a little bit of lower invertebrates, where we have the capacity to, maintain the balance in our internal environment compared to that of external environment. So this balance is called as homeostasis. So in homeostasis, what we do is we create this internal balance environment, irrespective of whether we go in 10 degrees Celsius or if we go in 40 degrees Celsius, our body's internal temperature remains constant. So this constant consistency in temperature enables us to go into different habitats. You can just survive in 2 or 3 degrees Celsius for some time, right? Again, when it is very high temperature, you start sweating, right? And but you're able to balance this. The change in the you're able to balance this difference. So this is called as warm-blooded organisms. We are called as warm-blooded organisms. So there is a lot of physiological adaptations that has happened. Even though majority of the success of the mammals depend is completely credited to our ability to regulate our body temperature, but remember that it's like affording this luxury. Organisms like mammals are able to regulate the temperature, okay, internal temperature. This balance of heat and cold requires a lot of energy. You have to invest a lot of energy to keep your body warm all the time, irrespective of what's happening outside. So this uh, this affordability for the energy is not there for all the organisms. Only higher organisms or very small part of the entire living kingdom have this capacity, to just regulate their body temperature because they're able to afford to spend the amount of energy it requires to create that heat and create that internal temperature. Whereas if you see the lower organisms, in most of the organisms do not have this capacity to afford that much of energy. So now what happens is you have this heat loss. So for example, in lower organisms, if you see that compared to that of their body surface area and its volume, now what happens is its surface area is very large compared to that of the body volume. That is why they lose a lot of heat. Understood? So now based on that, they keep on adapting to the conditions. So now just coming to this point that we have two sets of organisms which have the capacity, one to maintain the internal temperature and others to just cannot maintain. They're called as cold-blooded organisms. Based on that, we have eurythermal and stenothermal. What are called as eurythermal? They can tolerate wide range of temperatures, such as mammals, and you have stenothermals, and they can only live in a very narrow temperatures. Okay, most of the organisms. Now, very important factor that is with respect to abiotic factor is water. See, water is such an important factor. We know that the life on our planet started from water, and not only that, that might be a very important reason. Apart from that, if you observe uh, land animals, okay, all the animals or all the organisms that live on land, you can see that there is directly or indirect dependency on water because water is a medium for many of the physiological functions to happen, in a living system. So now, according to the availability of water, you can expect that in our earth, the precipitation levels or the availability of water is not even. Some regions receive excessive rainfall, and some regions do not receive rainfall at all. Some regions experience precipitation in the form of snow. Okay, so based on this, we have three different types of. We can classify into three different types. One is you have desert environments where there is extreme scarcity, and then you have the availability of fresh water, and then you don't have it. Okay, and it's in the form of ice. Now, what happens is the type of water that is present determines the type of organism that survive. Now, if you see most of the forest, you can see that this plant life is sustaining on fresh water source. Okay. Whereas if you see in the coastal regions, you don't see that much of vegetation compared to that of the tropical forest. This is because of the change in water. So what kind of water are we talking? In our entire planet, we have two important sources of water, and one most important part is the fresh water. So majority is salt water. In salt water, life has thrived in 30 to 35 parts per thousand. Okay, parts per thousand salinity in the sea. So that is where the life, most of the ocean life has adapted to. And then we have our fresh water source, which is very, very limited, where it is less than 5 with respect to ponds, rivers, etc. So this salinity is a very important factor. Why? Because you know that it's not possible to balance your osmotic environment within your body when you have change in the salinity. If you swim in the oceans for some time, you can see that a lot of water is lost, and your fingers start to wrinkle very fastly. Why? Because your body has lost a lot of water. Because of the change in the salt concentration, osmolarity or osmoregularity within the system becomes a challenge. So that is why organisms are specifically adapted to the salinity ranges in the water. So we can't drink sea water and survive. Similarly, the sea animals cannot live in the fresh water because of its adaptation, physiological adaptations to certain salinity. Now, you have certain hypersaline lagoons where it is greater than 100 parts per thousand. Usually, we measure salinity in parts per thousand, not millennium. So you just remember this, okay? Parts per thousand. Understood? So now, based on the tolerance level of the organisms to salinity or saline environments, you have two types of organisms. One is urihaline, and then you have stenohaline. Urihaline organisms are the one which have the capacity for wide range of salinities. Okay. So, example, you have certain fishes in the ocean, okay, that migrates from, for example, swordfish, okay. This fish migrates from ocean to the freshwater, for the breeding, okay, for laying its young ones. So, similarly, we have some of the organisms which migrate from freshwater to freshwater or freshwater to seawater, okay, and seawater to seawater, etc., based on the requirement of certain saline environments. Okay, next one we have stenohalines. For example, human beings, we cannot tolerate a very wide range of salinity. We have a very narrow range of salinity tolerance. All mammals, okay, and plant lives in your tropical regions. So we are all stenohaline because we don't have the capacity to tolerate wide range of salinity. Okay, so next one. So coming to the light. So light is another important factor. So why light is very important factor? You know that the light is the source of energy. Sunlight is a source of photosynthesis for the production of biomass. Correct, right? So based on the availability of sunlight, you know that only a certain part of sunlight is very useful for photosynthesis. So that is why, with the distribution of daylight cycles, like you know that in your equatorial regions, you can have a very clear balance between your day and night hours. You're like 10 hours of day, and then you have your 14 hours of night, or similar to that, very close to the half, like 12 hours day, 12 hours night out of 24 hours. So this daylight balance, what happens is it gives enough amount of exposure for these plants to photosynthetically participate, and there is abundant amount of availability of sunlight. So that is why what happens in the equatorial regions, the vegetation is very, very high. And as we go to the polar regions, because of the change in the light cycles, day-night cycles, now the vegetation becomes lesser and lesser because of the low availability of light. Understood? So based on the low light or the light that is available, plants and animals have their own unique adaptations. For example, you have photoperiodism in plants. In many of the flowering plants, what happens is, so we have short day plants and then we have long day plants. Some plants require very high amount of daylight and very short amount of night, and vice versa. So they have a critical period. Until then, they need to be exposed for so that the flowering is induced in this plants. So that is about photoperiodism. And then we have in animals which use diurnal and seasonal variations. So based on that, understood. So for example, their wake up cycles, everything depends upon the availability of light, right? The behavior, mostly the behavior and physiological activities depend upon light. Okay. So next one, as I told you that we have light as a very important source for photosynthesis, and based on the intensity of light that is received. For example, if you see on land, the light availability is very abundant, especially in the equatorial region. Now, when you go to the oceans actually what happens is the penetration of light depends upon the depth, correct, right? So as we go deeper, the light becomes very hard for the light to penetrate deeper into the bottoms. So that is when the light becomes absent. And you have different organisms, as I mentioned earlier, who have adapted to no light conditions. Light is the ultimate source of energy in majority of the organisms. What happens in the absence of light? You can see that organisms have adapted to chemotrophism. Okay, so we have phototrophic animals, and then we have chemotrophic, right? So they are chemoautotrophs where they use chemical energy for the for the synthesis of ATP. They do not depend upon light. So that is how they survive. Okay. So in marine plants also you can see that based on the depth. For example, you can't find coral reefs in very deep ocean. You can find it in very shallow beaches, right? That is because they require certain amount of light for their survival. Okay. Next abiotic factor is soil. Now the soil composition and the soil that is available in one particular region is not similar to the other region. That is because the soil varies according to the geography, right? So based on its variations, you know that the soil is a very important factor because it is a source of many of the nutrients such as minerals. Okay, so the soil composition, the grain size, aggregation, water holding capacity, okay, and etc. What it does is it determines how much of your vegetation can grow in a particular region. So how does the property of a soil change? Because the soil are from different climatic and weathering processes. For example, if it is in mountains, very, very rocky. So you have, based on the mineral composition, you have black soil, red soil, correct, right? Water holding capacity, you have clay and you have, sand. So based on this, the soil properties will change. So if you have the properties changing, one of the major characteristics is water holding capacity. So water holding capacity is a very determinant factor for how much it can hold this water, which can help the plants to grow. Correct, right? So that is why the soil becomes a very important factor. Understood? One second. Yeah, we'll go for the next one. Is it understood? Are you following? Okay. So apart from we understood that there are some factors that influence the organisms. Okay, and based on this, we have abiotic and we have biotic factors. Now we studied what are the abiotic factors that affect the organisms. Now we will understand, based on the variations in the abiotic factors, how organisms have adapted or how they respond to these abiotic factors. Now, based on how they respond, there are four ways in which organisms can react. Okay, how the organisms would have reacted. Either they regulate or confirm, migrate or suspend. So this is how they try to balance themselves with the change in environment. So let's see, what does it mean. Now the first way in which we respond is regulate as organisms. Okay, now when I say regulate, what is the meaning of regulate? You have to take all the higher organisms such as human beings, birds, and okay, vertebrates, all mammals, you take birds, and you take some of the lower vertebrates. So here we have a highest rate of success because we are able to balance ourselves, okay, through a mechanism called as homeostasis. Homeostasis means it is a balance of internal environment with a change in the external environment. So now you are always at balance, okay? For example, with respect to temperature, with respect to pH. So basically, mostly we will just corner it to temperature. So if your ability to adapt to the change in temperature is a very, very important characteristic feature. Why? Because if you cannot adapt to these temperatures, it becomes very difficult for you to, balance this energy. So that is why what happens, the higher organisms, they spend a lot of energy to produce this heat to balance this difference, whereas the lower organisms do not have that. Understood? So this regulate means an organism has the capacity to maintain homeostasis, okay, or with respect to their physiology as well as behavior. Now this kind of a response is called as regulate. Understood? Now there are two types of regulation. One is thermal regulation, other one is osmoregulation. Okay, so that is how we do it. Now when it comes to thermal regulation, what happens? When it goes to cold, we start shivering and we get more hungry. Now we are burning a lot of energy to keep our body warm. We get more hungry when it is too cold outside. Next one is when it comes to, for example, you are working a very hot day. So when you're working in a very hot day, or when the temperature is very, very high, or it's in the summer, now what does your body do? Your body starts sweating. Okay, because it wants to cool the internal environment by removing the excess water. Correct, right? So this is how the thermal regulation happens in mammals. And then if you look at some of the organisms which are very, very small, now what happens with these organisms? When you see small organisms, what they do is they don't have the capacity to maintain this loss of energy. Why? Because the volume and the area actually varies, as I told earlier. Because of this, they have to spend a very high amount of energy because they're losing heat at a very faster rate than they can produce. So this energy balance is not there. Understood? So that is why some of the organisms like hummingbird have evolved into very, very small. Okay. And then we have another organisms, which is the kangaroo rat. So the kangaroo rat, how it has evolved is it even though it lives in a very harsh condition such as desert. Now you can see that this particular organism is trying to balance this scarcity of water by oxidizing fat. Okay, by fat oxidation, it produces its water and it performs all its physiological activities with this very less water. Okay, so based on the thermoregulation, we have two types of organisms. One is poikilotherms or cold-blooded organisms, and then we have poikilotherms, and then we have warm-blooded organisms. So when we talk about this poikilotherms or eurytherms, okay, see the balance in temperature is only possible to a very small group of organisms, whereas a large group of organisms do not have this capacity to do that. And I've told you already why it is, because of high energy demands to keep that. Okay, so these many majority of the organisms are cold-blooded organisms, and they have adapted in a very unique way. So how they have adapted is they don't have the balance. They don't actually have the capacity to balance this internal temperature. So we'll talk about this poikilotherms on what category they belong to in the coming slide. Okay. Whereas the modern organisms where they can transfer heat or they can balance heat, they will come under this regulator. Okay. Next one is conform. See, when I talked about this poikilotherms or cold-blooded organisms, they come under conform. So what happens in conform? If you take any of these organisms, what they do is they don't have the capacity to maintain this internal environment. Instead, what they do is, for example, if you take let's say sponges, and if you take echinoderms, okay, and some of the fishes, so what they do is instead of spending more of energy, they just change to the ambient environment. For example, if you have a very nice sunny day in a beach and if it is shallow and you have sponges, okay, and or you have your sea anemone, etc. So now what they do is they just get warmer with respect to the water. Okay, water also becomes warm in a nice sunny day. So exactly. Again, when it goes cold, they also get cold. That means they're just changing with the environment. This is called as conform. Whenever the organisms just change according to the environment ambience with respect to salinity, with respect to temperature, so they are called as conformers. Okay. So this happens in most of the aquatic organisms. So they balance in osmotic concentration with respect to body fluids as well as in temperature with respect to ambient temperature in the external environment. Okay, next one is migrate. So what is migrate? Migration is a very beautiful pattern that we observe in our environment. What we see is many of the organisms, they have built this capacity and have understood that there are different climates across the world. It's not the same. See, we humans, we are restricted to certain geographical area for a very long period of time. Now we have transportation, we move. But before, migration was a very challenging task for human beings. But organisms have evolved thousands and thousands of years ago. Okay, to understand that there are different climatic conditions and there are favorable conditions away from their home, and they can go and lay eggs or live out this harsh time in some other place. So that is called as migrate. So what they do in migrate is they escape these unfavorable conditions, and then they go to a different environment which they have adapted and evolved over a long period of time, and then they survive there. So this is called as migrate. Migrating is moving away from stressful habitats. Okay, stressful habitats. For example, we have in the national park of Koilado, Rajasthan. So a large amount of migratory birds come from Siberia. Okay, and other extremely cold conditions from northern regions. Okay. Next one is suspend. What happens in suspend? we know that the bacterial spores or protozoan spores or fungal spores. So we know that in unfavorable conditions they become a spore or a seed. So they go into a certain period of dormancy or stress during the stress conditions. Again, when it is normal, when the favorable conditions return, they break out of this dormancy and they become active spores or active organisms. So this is called a suspend. They completely shut down all the physiological activity. They have learned this art of utilizing very limited amount of energy during the unfavorable conditions. Since during unfavorable conditions they are not able to compensate this energy demands to keep them functioning, that's why they use very less amount of energy during this process, and they shut down most of the physiological process. So that is called as fungi. That is called as suspend. Excuse me. Okay. So we have understood that based on our abiotic factors, we have the organisms that have, responding to in a certain way. Some are balancing, some are, conforming to the external environment, some are migrating, and some are suspending completely. Correct, right? So next part is to do all this, what do organisms have to achieve? They have to achieve this process called as adaptations. So adaptations are not one day process or one step process. So these are thousands and thousands of years of evolutionary uh, results that has led to what the organism has adapted to a specific environment. Now, adaptation is not just one way. For example, you just look at the polar bear and it has a white fur to reflect most of the sunlight, and to live in extreme cold, it has a large amount of fat. No. Now, when we talk about adaptations, we talk about many aspects with respect to that organism, such as morphological adaptations, physiological adaptations, behavioral adaptations. Okay. So these are the combined efforts of different areas where the organisms have adapted to live in a certain environment. Now, coming to the adaptations, okay. So let's see what are the different adaptations. You might be very, what do you tell, very aware of this process. For example, let's take few examples to understand adaptations. As I told, there is a kangaroo rat. Okay, so this kangaroo rat from Australia. So they don't have enough water there. So what happens is it has the capacity to, oxidize its fat to compensate the water. Okay, this is one adaptation. Okay, next one is if you talk about the desert plants. So the desert plants have very thick cuticle to prevent the loss of water, and they have sunken stomata again to prevent the precipitative loss. And the photosynthetic pathway is through CAM pathway because in the direct light they lose a lot of water, so they switch their photosynthetic process to night. Okay. Next one, if you take Opentia, okay, the cactus, they don't have leaves. Instead, the stems perform the process of photosynthesis, right? And this is a very important point that you have to remember. If you talk about some of the mammals, okay, especially in the very colder regions, you don't find many of the small mammals that are living there. You see very large animals living there. Why this is because the small animals, they lose heat very fastly, and it is highly impossible for them to adapt to such conditions being a mammal. So that is why you don't have a large small mammals living there. But when you see some of the mammals that are surviving there, they have very short ears and they have short limbs. For example, seal, if you see, why? Because it prevents them from losing a lot of heat. The large limbs, okay, they are creating more surface area so that the body loses a lot of heat. Okay, so this process of having this adaptation of having short ears and short limbs is also called as an Allen's rule. An example for an Allen's rule. So Allen's rule says that an adaptation is to, for example, have shorter surface area to prevent, loss of heat. Okay. Next one. If you talk about some of the Arctic organisms such as seals, and if you take snow leopards or whales, they have a very large amount of fat layer just below the skin, okay, which is called as a blubber. The blubber is present for them to for dual purpose. One purpose is to prevent the loss of water and heat, okay, and the second purpose is as they go dive in large depths, So it prevents them. It insulates them from pressure. Okay, that they change in pressure. Okay. So now coming to some of the organisms that have adapted, Archaebacteria, it's a very unique kind of organisms. It's very ancient organisms. That is why they have this unique character. So they have shown that life has thrived in a very harsh conditions, such as living in hot springs and deep thermal vents. Okay, where the temperature is very, very high and it's very acidic also. Okay. And many of the marine fishes in Antarctica, where the temperatures are sub-zero, okay, below 0 degrees Celsius, they have, instead of freezing, they have the capacity to perform normal organisms. And the reason for that is they have physiological adaptations where some of the proteins, they help these organisms uh, to protect these enzymes or keep these enzymes functioning. Okay, so some of these physiological adaptations with respect to um, fishes from tropical areas. Whereas many of the marine invertebrates and fishes have been discovered recently, which are known to live in a very, very deep sea. And the pressure, as I told you before, the pressure in the deep sea is so high, right? So it's not normal for a a land animal to just even imagine living there for a second or a millisecond. Okay, so that is the harshest conditions that the organisms have been adapted to live. Okay, so one of the adaptations that you can find on yourself is just take an example that you're climbing. Okay, if you think that adaptations are like kind of not happening, so your body adapts very fastly. So one such example is if you talk about climbing a mountains. Okay, as you go up the mountains, now what happens with the rise in altitude, the atmospheric pressure becomes less. As the atmospheric pressure becomes less, what is happening? The air becomes thinner and thinner, and you have very less oxygen. So when the oxygen is very less and the atmosphere is very, very low pressure, now your body starts experiencing something called as altitude sickness. So in altitude sickness, you have lots of symptoms such as you feel like vomiting, that is nausea, and you have heart palpitations, and then you have headaches, you have fatigue, okay, and then you have tiredness. So because of that, your body is not able to perform normally. Sometimes what happens, the brain even swells because of this low altitude, low oxygen. So now what happens is the climbers, they go and settle at a certain height. Like before going to 8,000 meters, they settle at 3,000, 5,000, and they spend some days at high altitudes. So when they spend that time, your body acclimatizes to the change in the environment, and you start adapting to this low oxygen and low atmospheric condition. So that is what happens with respect to one of the adaptations that we can see. Okay. Whereas if you just give me a second. Yeah. So another aspect of this adaptation is behavioral adaptations. For example, you can see that many of the lizards or some of the snakes that live in desert conditions, they live in extremely hot conditions, right? So that is why what they do is whenever sometimes desert gets very, very cold. For example, if you take Thar Desert, and in the day it's very, very hot. So what happens here? The lizards who have adapted to these conditions, or the snakes who have adapted to these conditions, they are cold-blooded. They bask in the sun whenever they require this temperature, and whenever there is harsh light, they just escape into the deep burrows and then they spend their time here. So that is how they try to balance with respect to the change. Okay. So now we have to discuss about population. Till now, do you have any doubts?